The Sherman tank's steel hull screamed as the Panzerfaust rocket tore through its side armor, but instead of the usual inferno that killed entire crews in seconds, Sergeant Louis Perrin's men walked away without a scratch. The other tank commanders couldn't believe it. They'd seen dozens of Shermans turn into crematoriums from the same hit. Yet Perrin's crew climbed out laughing, covered in water and rust, but very much alive. Inside that tank was something nobody in the 2nd Armored Division had ever seen before. Something cobbled together from salvaged junk that would soon change how American tanks survived the killing fields of Normandy. What Perrin had done with a few stolen buckets and desperate ingenuity was about to save hundreds of lives. But first, he had to survive long enough to prove it worked. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The hedgerows of Normandy in June 1944 were nature's perfect ambush sites, and Louis Perrin knew it better than most. At 28 years old, the French-American sergeant from New Orleans had volunteered for the armored divisions because his father, a veteran of the Great War, had told him tanks were the future of warfare. That was before Louis learned that American Sherman tanks were essentially rolling coffins when facing German Panzers and Panzerfaust rockets. The mechanics were brutal and simple. German anti-tank weapons punched through the Sherman's thin armor, and the resulting shrapnel ignited the gasoline stored inside, creating what the tank crews grimly called a brew-up. The ammunition would cook off seconds later, and anyone still inside died screaming. Louis had seen it happen 11 times in the first week after D-Day, and each time the smell of burning flesh lingered in his nostrils for hours afterward. Louis wasn't just any tank sergeant, though. Before the war, he'd worked in his uncle's metalworking shop in the French Quarter, learning to weld, fabricate, and solve mechanical problems with whatever materials were at hand. His mother was French, his father American, and he spoke both languages fluently, which made him valuable for liaising with the local Norman farmers and resistance fighters. But it was his mechanical mind that set him apart, that constant tinkering mentality that saw solutions where others saw only problems. He'd already modified his tank suspension to handle the rough Norman terrain better, had rigged up a better ventilation system for the crew compartment, and had even fashioned makeshift armor skirts from salvaged German steel plates. His tank, nicknamed Cajun Thunder, was a testament to field ingenuity, but none of his modifications addressed the core problem that kept him awake at night: the fuel tank vulnerability that turned Shermans into death traps. The morning of June 18th dawned gray and wet, with a persistent drizzle that turned the Norman soil into thick mud. Louis's platoon was positioned near the village of Saint-Jean-de-Day, holding a defensive line while American forces prepared for a push towards Saint-Lô. His crew consisted of 4 other men: driver Danny Kowalski from Chicago, a stocky kid with hands that could coax a dying engine back to life; gunner Raymond Dubois, a quiet Canadian with French heritage who could hit a target at 800 yards; loader Marcus Washington, a former railway worker from Alabama with arms like tree trunks; and radio operator Vincent Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco, whose calm under fire made him invaluable. They'd been together since training at Fort Knox, and Louis trusted them with his life, which in a Sherman tank meant trusting them to get out fast when the inevitable happened. That afternoon, they received orders to probe German positions near a tree line about half a mile east of their position. Intelligence suggested a German infantry company had dug in there, possibly with anti-tank support. Louis felt the familiar knot in his stomach as Kowalski fired up the engine. The Sherman's radial motor roared to life, belching blue smoke, and they rumbled forward across the muddy field. 2 other Shermans from their platoon, Lucky 7 and Iron Duke, moved in formation to their left and right. The hedgerows loomed ahead, ancient earthen barriers topped with dense vegetation that created a maze of narrow lanes and blind corners. Perfect killing ground for German ambushers with Panzerfaust rockets. They'd covered maybe 300 yards when Louis spotted movement in the hedgerow ahead. He was about to call out a warning when the Panzerfaust rocket screamed out of the foliage, trailing smoke as it spiraled toward Lucky 7. The explosion was tremendous, an orange fireball that engulfed the Sherman's hull. Louis watched in horror as the tank's hatches blew open, flames shooting 30 feet into the air as the ammunition cooked off. One crew member managed to tumble out, his uniform on fire, rolling in the mud as his screams cut through the afternoon air. The other 4 never made it out. Within 40 seconds, Lucky 7 was a burning hulk, black smoke pouring from every opening as the fire consumed everything inside. Iron Duke reversed immediately, laying down suppressing fire with its machine gun, but another Panzerfaust streaked from a different position and caught its rear quarter. The explosion wasn't as catastrophic, but Louis could see flames licking at the engine compartment. The crew bailed out fast, abandoning their tank as small arms fire kicked up mud around their feet. They made it to cover, but 2 tanks were now dead in the water, and the German infantry were advancing from the tree line. Louis had seconds to decide. Retreat meant leaving wounded men behind. Advance meant potentially joining Lucky 7's fate. He chose to fight. Cajun Thunder's 75mm gun barked, sending a high-explosive round into the hedgerow where the first Panzerfaust had originated. The explosion shredded vegetation and, hopefully, whoever had fired the rocket. Kowalski drove them forward at an angle, trying to give the Germans a harder target while closing distance. Another Panzerfaust shot missed them by feet, the rocket corkscrewing past the turret and detonating harmlessly in the field behind them. Louis could feel his heart hammering as adrenaline flooded his system. Dubois fired again, then again, methodically working over suspected German positions while Washington fed shells into the breach with mechanical efficiency. Chen was calling for artillery support on the radio, his voice steady despite the chaos outside. They made it to the wounded man from Lucky 7, a young private named Henderson, whose face was a mess of burns. Marcus kicked open the turret hatch and helped drag Henderson onto the back deck of the Sherman, while Kowalski kept the tank moving, weaving to avoid presenting a stationary target. German machine gun bullets pinged off the armor like angry hornets, but the tank's steel held. They picked up 2 more survivors from Iron Duke before finally pulling back under cover of smoke grenades and artillery fire that Chen had called in. By the time they made it back to their lines, Louis was shaking from the aftermath of combat adrenaline, but his mind was already churning with the problem that had haunted him since D-Day. That evening, as medics worked on Henderson and the other wounded men, Louis sat on Cajun Thunder's front glacis plate and stared at nothing. Vincent Chen climbed up beside him, offering a canteen of water cut with a splash of contraband whiskey. They drank in silence for a while, listening to the distant rumble of artillery exchanges and the closer sounds of men trying to sleep despite the war. Finally, Vincent spoke in his careful, measured way. "We can't keep doing this. We got lucky today, but Lucky 7 didn't. At this rate, we'll all be dead by July." Louis nodded slowly, taking another pull from the canteen. "I know. The problem's the fuel tank and ammunition storage. One penetrating hit and everything cooks off. The armor's too thin, and there's no good way to suppress the fires once they start." Vincent was quiet for a moment, then asked, "So what do we do? We can't exactly requisition thicker armor or redesign the tank." Louis smiled grimly. "No, but maybe we can work around it. Back home, my uncle's shop had a steel tempering process where we'd quench hot metal in water to control the cooling. Water absorbs heat incredibly well. If we could somehow line the crew compartment with water reservoirs, maybe we could absorb enough heat from a penetrating hit to prevent the fuel from igniting, or at least slow it down enough for the crew to bail out." Vincent looked at him skeptically. "Where are you going to get water reservoirs? And how would you mount them without interfering with operations?" That was the question that kept Louis awake that night, lying in his bedroll under Cajun Thunder's protective bulk. He couldn't simply weld water tanks to the interior walls. There wasn't time, materials, or clearance from command for such modifications. But there had to be something simpler, more improvised. As he drifted toward sleep, his mind wandered through memories of his uncle's shop, the tools and materials they had used, the creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems. He remembered an incident where a small fire had broken out near the welding station. His uncle had grabbed the nearest bucket, which happened to be full of dirty water, and doused the flames before they could spread. The bucket itself had been scorched but intact. And Louis remembered thinking how effective such a simple tool could be. Buckets. The idea hit him like a revelation around 3 a.m. Buckets filled with water, lined along the interior walls of the tank. They wouldn't stop a penetrating hit, but they might absorb the initial blast heat and shrapnel, preventing ignition of the fuel stores. Steel buckets would provide an additional layer of fragmentation protection, while the water would serve as both thermal mass and potential fire suppressant if it spilled. It was crude, Almost absurdly simple, but it might just work. The question was whether he could find enough buckets and whether his crew would think he'd lost his mind. At dawn, Louis gathered his crew and explained his idea. The reactions were mixed. Danny Kowalski laughed, thinking it was a joke, then realized Louis was serious and scratched his head thoughtfully. Buckets? In the tank? Won't they get in the way? Marcus Washington was more enthusiastic. Man, I don't care if we line this thing with chamber pots if it keeps us from burning alive. Where do we get the buckets, though? Raymond Dubois, ever practical, asked the key question. How many buckets are we talking about? And what do we do about sloshing water while we're moving? Vincent Chen just nodded slowly, seeing the logic even if the execution seemed crazy. Finding buckets in a war zone proved easier than Louis expected. The Norman farms were full of them. Sturdy steel pails used for everything from milking cows to hauling water. Some had been abandoned when civilians fled the fighting. Others were liberated from damaged buildings. Louis traded cigarettes, chocolate, and other precious commodities to acquire more. Within 2 days, they had assembled 37 buckets of various sizes, plus several larger containers that had once held cooking oil or fuel. They scrounged rope, wire, and metal brackets from damaged equipment and vehicles. The real challenge was figuring out how to secure everything inside the cramped tank interior without impeding movement or operation of the guns and equipment. Louis spent hours inside Cajun Thunder with a measuring tape and notebook, sketching out placement options. The crew compartment wasn't large, roughly 6 feet wide by 8 feet long, with a curved ceiling that rose to maybe 5.5 feet at the center. The turret took up significant space, and there were ammunition racks, the main gun breech, radio equipment, and a dozen other essential components competing for room. But there were gaps, spaces between structural supports, areas behind the driver's position, spots above the ammunition racks where buckets could be wedged or hung without interfering with operations. Louis designed a system of brackets welded to existing structural points, with wire supports that would hold buckets at various angles against the hull walls. The actual installation took 3 days of intensive work during brief periods when they were pulled back from the line. Louis did most of the welding himself, using a portable rig borrowed from the maintenance company. He reinforced weak points with salvaged steel plate, created drain holes in the bucket bottoms so water could escape in a controlled manner if heated, and positioned the largest containers where they'd provide the most protection to fuel lines and ammunition storage. The crew helped where they could, but mostly they watched their sergeant work with the focused intensity of a man possessed by an idea. Other tankers wandered by to see what the crazy Cajun was up to, and word spread through the division about Perrin's bucket armor. The jokes were inevitable and often crude. Someone started calling Cajun Thunder the Slop Bucket Special. Another wit suggested they should paint the words Water Buffalo on the side. A captain from battalion headquarters stopped by to see what the commotion was about, took one look inside the tank, and shook his head in disbelief. Sergeant Perrin, this is the most ridiculous thing I've seen in 3 years of military service. You're violating about a dozen regulations and probably compromising the tank's combat effectiveness. I should order you to remove all this immediately. He paused, looking at the burned hulk of Lucky 7, still sitting in the nearby field. But I'm not going to. God knows we need something to keep our boys alive. Just don't blow yourself up testing this contraption. When Louis finally finished, Cajun Thunder looked strange inside. Buckets lined the walls at various heights and angles, some hanging from wire supports, others wedged between structural elements. Each was filled with water, carefully leveled to about 3/4 capacity to minimize sloshing. The total water weight added roughly 400 pounds to the tank, which worried Danny Kowalski from a performance standpoint. But field tests showed the Sherman's engine could handle it without significant speed or maneuverability loss. More concerning was the feeling of being inside what amounted to a floating reservoir. The crew had to learn to move differently, avoiding the buckets while still accessing equipment and ammunition. It took practice, but within a day they had adapted to the new configuration. The real test came on July 2nd, during Operation Overlord's bloody push towards St. Lo. Louis' platoon, now reinforced with 2 replacement Shermans after Lucky 7 and Iron Duke's losses, was assigned to support an infantry advance through particularly dense hedgerow country near La Haye-du-Puy. Intelligence suggested German forces were withdrawing, but everyone knew the retreat would be contested every yard. The Germans had perfected the art of defensive combat in this terrain, using every hedge, ditch, and stone building as a strong point. For American tankers, it meant running a gauntlet of Panzerfausts, anti-tank guns, and occasionally a Panther or Tiger tank that could kill a Sherman from ranges where the American 75mm gun was nearly useless. They moved out at dawn with infantry advancing on foot alongside the tanks. The day started quietly, which made everyone nervous. Danny Kowalski drove cautiously, knowing that speed meant nothing when you couldn't see more than 30 yards ahead. Louis kept his head partially out of the turret hatch, scanning for threats despite the risk of sniper fire. Raymond Dubois had a high-explosive round loaded and ready. Marcus Washington stood bad prepared to feed whatever ammunition was needed. Vincent Chen monitored the radio, coordinating with the infantry and other tanks. The water in the buckets sloshed gently with each movement, a strange soundtrack to combat operations. The German ambush came at 10:30 in the morning in a sunken lane between two massive hedgerows. A Panzerfaust team had concealed themselves in a ditch covered with branches and camouflage netting, invisible until they fired. The rocket hit Cajun Thunder's left front armor at an angle, penetrating the sponson near where Danny Kowalski sat. The explosion inside was catastrophic, but not fatal. Louis felt the concussion like a physical blow, his ears ringing as smoke and fire filled the compartment. Shrapnel ricocheted off the interior surfaces with sharp pinging sounds. At least 3 of the buckets exploded from the impact, sending water cascading across the hot metal surfaces. Steam hissed violently as water hit superheated shrapnel and burning fragments. But the fuel didn't ignite. The ammunition didn't cook off. Instead of an inferno, there was chaos, water, smoke, and the acrid smell of burning paint and rubber, but no runaway fire. Louis heard Danny screaming, not in death agony, but in pain and shock. Marcus was shouting something about getting out. Raymond had already traversed the turret toward the ambush site and fired blindly through the smoke. Vincent was calling for medical support on the radio, his voice tight but controlled. Louis's training kicked in. "Ceasefire! Ceasefire! Danny, can you move? Everyone sound off." The responses came quickly. Danny was hit but mobile. The others were shaken but unhurt. The tank's engine was still running. Louis made a split-second decision. "Kowalski, back us out. Everyone stay put. We're still combat effective." Danny, despite his wounds, threw the Sherman into reverse and gunned the engine. They lurched backward out of the kill zone, while Raymond pumped 2 more high-explosive rounds into the hedgerow where the Panzerfaust had originated. Infantry rushed forward to clear the position, killing or capturing the German anti-tank team. Within 2 minutes, they were behind cover again, and Louis could assess the damage properly. Danny had caught shrapnel in his left arm and shoulder, painful but not life-threatening. The tank's interior was a mess of spilled water, soot, and damaged equipment, but structurally everything important was intact. Most importantly, everyone was alive. The infantry medic who treated Danny while they were pulled back couldn't believe what he was seeing. "You took a Panzerfaust hit to the sponson? That should have killed everyone. What the hell is all this water from?" Louis explained about the buckets while the medic worked. The young man kept shaking his head in amazement. "Sergeant, I've seen a dozen Shermans brew up from hits like that. Whatever you did here, it saved your crew's lives. You need to report this up the chain." Louis nodded, but his mind was already working through improvements. Several buckets had been destroyed by the blast, leaving gaps in coverage. He needed better bracketing to keep the buckets from becoming projectiles themselves. The water had worked better than he dared hope, but the system needed refinement. Word of Cajun Thunder's survival spread through the division faster than official reports could travel. By evening, Louis had 3 other tank commanders asking him to explain his bucket armor system. He showed them the setup, walked them through the installation process, and shared what had worked and what needed improvement. Within a week, 6 other Shermans in the 2nd Armored Division were sporting similar modifications, each crew adding their own variations. Some used barrels instead of buckets. Others incorporated sand-filled containers for additional shrapnel protection. A few enterprising crews combined both water and sand in a layered defense system. The modifications spread organically through the division as crews sought any edge that might keep them alive. Official reaction was more complicated. A major from Division Engineering showed up to inspect Cajun Thunder 3 days after the ambush. He spent an hour inside the tank, taking measurements, asking technical questions, and examining the damage from the Panzerfaust hit. Louis expected to be ordered to remove the modifications, but instead, the major surprised him. Sergeant Perrin, this is completely unauthorized and violates several technical regulations regarding modifications to issued equipment. It's also probably the most innovative field engineering I've seen in this war. I'm forwarding a full report to higher headquarters, with a recommendation that we study this approach for potential wider adoption. In the meantime, you're authorized to continue using this configuration and to assist other crews who want to implement similar systems. Congratulations, you might have just saved the Army a lot of dead tankers. The bucket armor wasn't perfect. It added weight that reduced speed slightly and put extra strain on the Sherman's already taxed suspension. The water needed to be refilled regularly, which added to maintenance workload. In winter conditions, which they'd face later in the war, freezing became an issue that required additives or heated systems. Some hits still resulted in catastrophic fires if they struck at exactly the wrong angle or with sufficient force to overwhelm the water's heat absorption capacity. But, statistically, tanks using some version of Perrin's bucket system survived ambushes at nearly 3 times the rate of standard Shermans. That translated to lives saved, crews who went home after the war, instead of dying in burning holes on French roads. Louis and his crew continued fighting through France and into Germany. Danny Kowalski recovered from his wounds and returned to the driver's seat, proud of his scars and the story behind them. They survived 2 more Panzerfaust hits, numerous near misses, and one terrifying engagement with a Panther tank that ended with the German crew abandoning their superior vehicle after Raymond Dubois managed an incredibly lucky shot through the Panther's thinner side armor. Cajun Thunder earned a reputation as the luckiest tank in the division, though Louis always insisted it wasn't luck, but preparation and adaptation. The bucket armor evolved continuously based on combat experience, each iteration slightly better than the last. By August 1944, official word came down from Ordnance Corps headquarters. Army engineers had been studying tank survivability and were developing a new wet-stowage system for Sherman tanks that would encase ammunition racks in water-filled jackets, dramatically reducing cook-off incidents. While this system was far more sophisticated than Lewis's improvised buckets, the principle was identical, using water as a thermal barrier and fire suppressant. The official documentation didn't credit Sergeant Louis Perrin by name, but everyone who'd been in Normandy knew where the idea had originated. The wet-stowage Shermans started appearing in Europe by late 1944, and their improved survival rates validated everything Louis had been arguing since June. The war continued its grinding advance toward Germany. Louis' platoon fought through the Falaise Gap, the liberation of Paris, the brutal autumn campaigns in the Hurtgen Forest, and finally, the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. Each engagement brought new challenges and new losses. Men died, tanks burned, and the random cruelty of combat took friends and strangers alike. But Cajun Thunder and its crew survived, protected by ingenuity and an increasingly refined defensive system that other crews had adopted and adapted. Louis received a Bronze Star for his actions in Normandy, though the citation made no mention of bucket armor, focusing instead on his rescue of wounded tankers under fire. Vincent Chen was killed in January 1945 during the Allied push into Germany, struck by artillery shrapnel while helping repair another tank's track. His death hit the crew hard. Vincent had been the calm center of their chaos, the voice of reason when combat stress threatened to overwhelm them. They buried him in a military cemetery near Bastogne, and Louis stood at the grave thinking about all the men who died in tanks that might have survived with better protection. Vincent's death wasn't related to tank fires or ammunition cook-offs. It was just the random violence of war, but it drove home the fact that no amount of engineering could make war safe. All you could do was improve the odds and fight for the men beside you. The crew welcomed a replacement radio operator, a kid from Brooklyn named Joseph Rosenberg, who was terrified of tanks, but too professional to show it much. Louis worked with him patiently, teaching him not just radio procedures, but how to survive in a Sherman, where to position himself during combat, how to bail out fast if needed, which sounds meant danger and which were normal. Joseph adapted quickly, and within a month he was part of the crew's rhythm, anticipating needs and reacting to threats with the smooth coordination that kept tank crews alive. He also became fascinated by the bucket armor system and helped Louis document it in a detailed notebook, complete with sketches and technical notes that Louis hoped might be useful for post-war analysis. They reached Germany's Ruhr Valley in March 1945, fighting through fanatical resistance from German units that knew they were defending the fatherland itself now. The war had taken on a desperate character, with the Germans using everything from children in Hitler Youth uniforms to elderly Volkssturm militia in increasingly futile attempts to halt the Allied advance. Louis found no satisfaction in the one-sided battles. These weren't the professional Wehrmacht soldiers they'd faced in Normandy. These were scared civilians pressed into service by a regime in its death throes. But the Panzerfaust still killed just as effectively, and the anti-tank guns still turned Shermans into coffins, so they fought on with grim determination. Cajun Thunder took its final hit on April 11th, 1945, in a small German town whose name Louis never learned. A Panzerfaust struck the turret ring, jamming the turret and starting a fire in the engine compartment. The bucket armor in the crew compartment kept the interior survivable long enough for everyone to bail out, but the tank itself was done. Louis stood in the muddy street watching his home of nearly a year burn, feeling an odd sense of loss mixed with gratitude. That tank had kept them alive through hundreds of miles of combat. It had proven a principle that would save countless other crews. Now, it was just another piece of destroyed equipment in a war that was finally, mercifully winding down. They walked away carrying their personal gear and the notebook Joseph had been maintaining, leaving Cajun Thunder to burn itself out behind them. The crew was assigned to a replacement Sherman, but they only operated it for 3 weeks before Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. Louis Perrin, now 29 years old and feeling twice that age, found himself in occupied Germany, helping process surrendering Wehrmacht units and securing captured equipment. It felt surreal after so many months of constant combat. He wrote letters home to New Orleans, trying to explain to his family what the war had been like, but finding that words failed to capture the reality. How could you explain the smell of a burning tank to someone who'd never experienced it? How could you convey the bond between men who'd survived together when others died? The army wanted him to stay in Germany as part of the occupation force, but Louis declined and requested discharge. He'd done his part. He wanted to go home, work in his uncle's shop, maybe find a wife and start a family in a world not dominated by war. The discharge came through in August 1945, accelerated by the point system and his combat record. Before he left Germany, a young engineer lieutenant from Ordnance Corps tracked him down and interviewed him extensively about the bucket armor concept, taking copious notes and photographs of the improvised systems that several tanks in the division were still using even after the war ended. The lieutenant told Louis that his idea had influenced the wet-stowage redesign and probably saved thousands of lives across the European theater. Louis accepted the thanks, but deflected the praise to his crew and to all the other tankers who'd innovated and adapted to survive. Danny Kowalski went back to Chicago and opened a garage, using his GI Bill benefits to buy equipment and hire other veterans. Raymond Dubois returned to Montreal and became a police officer, eventually rising to detective. Marcus Washington moved to Detroit and got a job at a Ford plant, helping build the civilian vehicles that would power America's post-war boom. Joseph Rosenberg went to college on the GI Bill, became an engineer himself, and spent his career working on military vehicle design, always crediting his time in Cajun Thunder with inspiring his interest in practical field engineering. They stayed in touch through letters and occasional reunions, bound by experiences that no one else could fully understand. Louis did return to New Orleans in his uncle's metalworking shop. He married a schoolteacher named Marie Broussard in 1947, and they had 3 children who grew up hearing sanitized versions of their father's war stories. Louis never talked much about the combat itself, the fear and death and random horror of it all, but he'd tell them about his crew, about problem-solving under pressure, about how sometimes the simplest solutions were the most effective. He kept the notebook that Joseph Rosenberg had maintained, and years later, he donated it to the National Archives, along with photographs and sketches of the bucket armor system. Researchers and military historians would cite it in studies of field modifications and soldier innovation during World War II. The Sherman tank's reputation remained complicated in the post-war years. Critics pointed to its thin armor and tendency to burn, calling it a death trap that was only effective due to overwhelming numbers. Defenders noted its reliability, ease of production, and the fact that it was good enough to win the war. The truth lay somewhere between these extremes. The Sherman was a compromise, optimized for mass production and strategic mobility rather than one-on-one duels with German heavy tanks. But soldiers like Louis Perrin had identified its critical weaknesses and developed practical solutions using available resources and field ingenuity. The wet-stowage modification that became standard on later Sherman variants was a direct result of such field innovation, proving that the Army could learn and adapt when it listened to the men doing the fighting. Louis Perrin lived to see the Cold War, Vietnam, and the advent of modern armored warfare. He watched as tank design evolved to incorporate lessons learned from World War II, including sophisticated fire suppression systems, improved armor configurations, and crew survivability features that went far beyond filling buckets with water. He saw men walk on the moon and computers shrink from room-sized machines to desktop devices. Through it all, he remained fundamentally the same person he had been in Normandy, a practical problem solver who believed in using your head and available resources to improve bad situations. His children inherited his mechanical aptitude, and 2 of his grandchildren became engineers, carrying forward the family tradition of making things work better. He died in 1998 at the age of 82, surrounded by family in the same New Orleans house he'd lived in for 50 years. His obituary in the Times-Picayune mentioned his Bronze Star and his service with the 2nd Armored Division, but it didn't mention the bucket armor. That story remains something of a legend among military historians and armor enthusiasts, occasionally appearing in specialized journals or books about tank warfare. Most people who read about wet stowage systems in Sherman tanks never learned about the desperate sergeant in Normandy who'd pioneered the concept with scavenged buckets and wire. But in certain circles, Louis Perrin's name carried weight. Veterans of the 2nd Armored Division remembered. Military engineers studying field modifications and soldier innovation cited his work. A few older tankers who'd served in Korea or even early Vietnam remembered hearing stories about the crazy Cajun who'd lined his tank with water buckets and somehow made it work. The principle he'd proven, that simple solutions applied with intelligence and courage could save lives, remained relevant across generations of military innovation. Sometimes the most sophisticated answer wasn't the best answer. Sometimes you just needed buckets, water, and the determination to try something different when standard procedures were getting people killed. The Sherman tanks that incorporated wet stowage modifications survived the war to fight in Korea, where American armor again faced situations where crew survivability was paramount. The lessons learned in Normandy about fire suppression and ammunition protection influenced designs for subsequent American tanks, from the M26 Pershing through the M48 Patton, and eventually to the M1 Abrams. Each generation of engineers built on the foundation laid by practical innovations like Lewis's bucket armor, refining and improving, but always working toward the same goal of bringing crews home alive. The sophisticated fire suppression systems in modern tanks, with their automatic extinguishers and compartmentalized designs, were spiritual descendants of buckets filled with water in a Norman hedgerow. History often focuses on the big decisions, the generals and their strategies, the politicians and their policies. But wars are won or lost in small moments, by individual soldiers making choices under pressure, by mechanics and sergeants who refuse to accept that the way things are is the way things must be. Louis Perrin was one of thousands of such men, tankers and infantry and engineers, who innovated constantly because their lives depended on it. His bucket armor wasn't elegant or sophisticated, but it worked well enough to save lives and inspire better solutions. In the end, that was what mattered, not the glory or recognition, but the simple fact that men who might have died instead made it home to their families because one sergeant refused to accept burning alive as an inevitable part of tank warfare. The story of how one man's desperate improvisation with steel buckets changed tank design doesn't appear in most World War II histories. It's a footnote at best, a curious anecdote about field modifications that anticipated official engineering solutions. But for the crews who survived because of wet stowage systems, for the families who got their fathers and husbands back alive, It represents something more fundamental about human ingenuity under pressure. War forces innovation. And sometimes the most important innovations come not from research laboratories or design bureaus, but from muddy fields in France where survival depends on thinking differently about simple tools, like buckets and water. Louis Perrin understood that, and in understanding it, he saved lives and left a legacy that outlasted the war that had tried so hard to kill him.